Something that's always so striking to me about that recording and about the poem is the way that it equates both articulation and articulateness with capacity, and that it basically uses a disfigurement of the voice as a stand-in for commentary on capacity. And that's something that I always find interesting and always want to put a little bit more pressure on. And I wonder if we might do that in our comments of thinking about how the futility of governing structures is represented by maybe ableist relationship to being to having the capacity of articulation.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Davey. Great way to start this. Max, your thought on this? Final word?
I'm struck by the Blonk's choice to turn this into this grunting, extremely forceful language that sounds like it's taking a bit of a toll on his diaphragm. Since we were talking, well, Tracie was talking about that earlier, right? The prompted by Gabe talking about the breath. I'm interested that that's the direction rather than maybe getting quieter or all the other choices he may have had with this poem to make a similar point. And I think it really calls our attention to how this poem is about speech acts, right? What the president will say and do, and he's over the course of the work, the performance, the speech really becomes this physical act, or it's the physicality of the speech act is very much in our face.
Thank you, Max. Lily next, and then Jason.
I'm thinking a lot about how many of the works in this week have different elements of humor, elements of play, and elements of experimentation, and the different ways those work together to kind of like create or make tone complicated. And like I always hear this piece as very scary, like a very dark tone, but then sometimes you hear people laughing in the recording, and so I'm just kind of interested in how conceptualism plus I liked how you said that earlier, as like a movement walks an interesting line with humor, play, experimentation to create like a tone you might or might not expect, or give you like a bodily reaction you might or might not expect. Because I was also here in the room when Jaap performed, and I would say the range of emotional reactions to his various pieces like ran a fascinating gambit from like laugh out loud, crying, laughing reactions to like literally physically backing away because his expressions seemed to be going out of control. So very interested in how all this is born out of like a quote unquote restraint or stricture sometimes imposed by conceptualism.
Thank you, Lily. Jason, final thought on this?
Probably in the private quarters of the White House, we were hearing similar sounds throughout the day. But what's interesting to me, among many other things, is the way in which for Jaap Blonk, the poem has a kind of built-in decay. And in terms of its duration, it's like we realize what's happening, and I still want to talk about Tracie Morris's poems for 3 years. But what Tracie's poems do, for me at least, is different than that, because the Jaap Blonk is unidirectional, and Tracie's poems create, for me, a kind of, because we were talking about the sentence, and there's no way to know where the poem is going to end. And there's this it creates this amazing tension between never wanting the poem to end and being really curious about where it will end.
Thank you, Jason. That was lovely. I want to turn to Gabe, and then Julia Block. I don't know how long you've been sitting there. Oh, well, I want Julia to grab the mic because we're doing final words and final thoughts for the webcast. And we just listened to Jaap Blonk talk about what the president will say and do.
I love that poem.
Yeah, and so I thought you might want to say hello and also comment on that. But first, let's go to Gabe. Gabe, what do you think?
Yeah, I actually, funny enough, have I think a very related comment to Lily's, which is I would really invite us to think more about tone and maybe mood in all of the conceptualist work of this week. Once I asked Jaap Blonk when he read at the Writer's House, like, how do you think about the moods you construct in your sound pieces without semantic content? And he was like, I don't. And you can do with that what you will, but I don't believe him because there is such palpable moods in the work that he makes. But the thing that's hard about mood and that's hard about tone with artwork is that you don't know where it lives. You don't know if it lives in the art or in you, if you're reacting to it, or if it's somewhere between you and the artwork. So it's something that I think we should think about further. And just as a recommendation, Before You Go is an amazing poem by Charles Bernstein. It's my favorite poem of his. And it's really beautiful, but it thinks about a lot of these things, I think, in kind of subtle ways.
Thank you, Gabe. Julia Block. Hello.
Hello.
Let the record show. Let the record show, and many people will know this. Those of us who have been involved in ModPo for a long time, including Mandana and MC, many people at this table. Julia helped us create ModPo, was the lead coordinator, TA, for several years, and is really fundamental to the way this thing works. And look, they're bringing the lights up on you.
It's going up.
Julia, welcome home. Welcome back.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Do you
I
have
just came in from the cold to catch the tail end of the webcast. Yeah, I love what Gabe just said, and it just makes me think of a lot of things, including this conversation I just had with Sarah Dowling that we're hoping to have a life somewhere in print. We were both talking about how we both have books coming out that use found language, and we talked about how language is always in conversation, even if you think you're plucking it out of thin air, and that's and we actually, in fact, talked a lot about tone and how the tonalities of a text that you may have appropriated from someone else's mouth or someone else's page has tonalities that you get to discover and the reader gets to discover along with you.
Thank you, Julia. Good to
Breezing
see you.
in with that amazing
Yeah,
comment.
really, like, this is
Breezing back out.
This is what happens. So I'd like to turn to Claire. We have to get a mic to Claire. And then Dave Poplar for final thoughts or anything about what the president will say and do.
Yeah, I've actually been thinking a lot with this week's poems about an archive and like what is an archive, especially with card catalogs. And Tracie, what you said about the body and longevity and like the body as an archive. So I think hearing this poem and hearing it build upon itself, I thought about speech as an archive. I don't know, that's just been going through my mind, and I guess it's like breaking those constraints about like what the archival process is and whether it's different or just the same thing, adding and adding and adding. So that's just kind of what was going through my brain when I heard that.
Thank you, Claire. And by the way, as our first and onlyest ModPo intern, which we're going to do again next year, say briefly what you're doing. I know you're working on curricula. You're creating lesson plans.
Yes.
For what age? What kind of student?
Roughly like secondary, middle school, high school. I'm a secondary education English major, so basically I'm trying to help translate ModPo into more accessible learning processes for someone who's like 13 to 18, and something that can be really worked into a classroom and in a group setting and more creative processes for poets. And we're grateful to you. We've been getting those. Anne and I have been getting weekly updates of these lesson plans, and who knew they were so organized? There's a whole format for lessons plans. So thank you, Claire. So let's turn to Dave Poplar, followed by Anna.
Just a brief comment. I was trying to think about this poem in light of the current impeachment hearings as you introduced it. I find it really interesting that the language as it's used in this poem, it doesn't just degrade, it becomes meaningless as language. It becomes absolutely without reference, just it means nothing. And it almost seems like that's where we're at now with these impeachment hearings. It's almost irrelevant what was actually said. We're talking about what happened on this one call, but the way we've come to interpret it, different sides of the aisle, it almost loses the reference. It's almost irrelevant about what was said, and we're just talking about the arguments themselves anymore. So it's almost like this poem is an extreme example of what's literally going on right now.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. Anna, final thought.
I am thinking about the first time that I ever heard this poem performed, and I think he's writing about President Bush, right?
No, it's actually Nixon.
Oh, it's Nixon?
I mean,
even better.
I should clarify. When he was at the seance with Madeline Gins, Madeline Gins wrote a book called What the President Will Say
which is
or
about
Do.
Nixon.
That was a response to Nixon. So there is a kind of symmetry here. Yeah.
Well, when I first encountered it, then I was thinking about both Presidents Bush and their various esophageal malfunctions. And hearing it at a time that was really different than this particular time. My reading of it, I'm like reminded also of Lily's comment about tone and Gabe's comment about tone, that there was something like scary funny about it, and now it's just scary, right? Like there was something about the Bush's ineptitude that, even though it caused like tremendous harm and tremendous violence, seemed like somehow less precarious than it is right now. And I really feel like that listening to this performance right now, what I hear most is like struggle and violence and like tremendous pain, really. So yeah, I wish I could follow up Gabe's question about like what do you think about, how do you think about tone? Because I really do want to think more about that. And it seems impossible that tone's not a consideration.
Thank you, Anna. We're going to turn to Jess, then Amber Rose, then Tracie, and then I'll have a couple of announcements to close out. Jess, final thought?
Sure. So many great things have already been said. That recording was startling to hear, and I really appreciated what Davey said about capacity, and I was thinking about that as everyone else was speaking, and it made me realize that part of what I was feeling as I listened to the recording was a kind of like retreat, or a kind of not like a violent recoiling, but a sort of like shrinking into exhaustion or something. Like I felt startled, but also very tired, I think, by the end of it. And, you know, that made me think about the very thing that Davey suggested, you know, we should put pressure on, which is to say, like, the presumption that, like, I don't know, a kind of critical act or a critical statement, you know, is joined with some kind of normative...
traveled here from Lead.
Is joined with some kind of normative capacity, whether for, speech or listening or resistance or really anything. And my recognition of like exhaustion kind of made me think of that. And hearing that for the first time is the first time I listened to it. Full disclosure.
Yikes.
Yikes, I know.
Yikes.
I know.
Wow.
Poor me.
Should have warned you.
No.
Thank you, Jess. Amber Rose. Amber Rose Johnson. The amazing Amber Rose Johnson.
So tone. I want to give a shout out to Ken Hay, who wrote a really phenomenal essay. And this essay is on my mind for essay 3 on O'Hara, because we were talking about Walt Whitman and how we deal with that legacy, and Davey brought up O'Hara. And for essay 3, we're talking about Personal Poem by Frank O'Hara, and a lot of the essays were sort of recounting the like New York school style, and that there are a lot of funny things in the poem. But Ken did this really, really incredible close reading where he's talking about this like strange underbelly, this strange tone that he couldn't quite figure out. And he brings up the 2 lines in the poem where O'Hara mentions Miles Davis being clubbed by a police officer. And I hadn't seen anyone else comment on those particular 2 lines in the poem. And they made me really uncomfortable, actually. Reading and sort of trying to engage with giving feedback on the essays, but there was this like violence, this police violence against a black man that we weren't accounting for in the class, in our conversations, in the essays. And it was really unsettling to me, this sort of what that was doing to the tone, and how this like violence against a black person was sort of the foundation on which O'Hara was having this otherwise like jovial experience of being on break. And yeah, I think there are a lot of poems like that where there's this sort of this tonal underbelly that we don't always get to engage with. And Ken did a really great job. And it was inspiring for me to see him sort of take that leap, even if he couldn't articulate what it was that was unsettling for him. So all that to say that tonal shifts are something that we can sort of feel in our bodies, even if we don't know why. And it's worth it to linger with what's unsettling. There could be something really important happening there.
Thank you, Amber Rose. Tracie Morris, final thoughts, but this is an opportunity for us all to say thank you for joining us today.
My
not
pleasure.
just here. Tracie Morris,
Thank you.
we're so grateful to you for hanging out with us.
And you got 2 special guests because Andrew came and hung out.
And
too.
Andrew, too.
Well, you know, I actually did comment about this a while ago because you invited me to talk about it with an early poem talk, very early poem talk. I don't remember what I said back then.
We talked about this?
Yeah, we talked
I
about this.
remember
This
it.
is the first time I heard Jaap.
Yeah.
Though there's a couple of interesting things. One is that Jaap has notation systems that he uses. So that's distinct, sort of complementary to our practices in working with sound. There's not like that many sound poets, so I love the opportunity to think about what he's doing, what the sound poet will say and do, and I like the I feel like we're colleagues in this particular subset of poetry. There's probably like 4 people, but anyway. And one of the things that I think is interesting in this poem is the way he interjects the line. He's not breaking that line down. He's interjecting with a whole other kind of sound. And then it overwhelms the official speak. So when you said that comment about, this is probably what's going on, less artistically, I compulsively said also. But it's like, how is it interjecting with a particular sort of tone that we expect from these hallowed halls? There's someone saying what the president will say and do, and then there's some other sound that absolutely has nothing to do with the construction of our democracy as we know it through the statement. And I just wonder, especially because we're talking about Nixon, Nixon said that famous line, if the president does it, it isn't illegal, right? So what the president will say and do is a speech act in this sort of flagrant disregard of a constitutional democracy versus whatever the utterance of a fiefdom is. And that's the interjection, I think, of that, that conversation that Jaap is also talking about. And, since Jaap is a European, he has references for like pre-democratic Europe also, which is, feudal systems. So I just think it's a super interesting and, sort of different way of approaching sound poetry that I really appreciate. And this is not just extemporaneous because he has notation systems, Jaap, that he thinks through these things very carefully.
Yeah, he does. Thank you again, Trace, for that comment and everything else, including a session we had this afternoon, which was not recorded, but which was very great, deep, thoughtful. Oh, well, I have a final thought on this, and then I want to just thank people and announce a plug next week. I just wanted to point out what was implicit in Jess's and others' comments here after listening to Blonk, which is that so many of the week 10, chapter 9.3 poems, especially when we get into Mod Po Plus, they're essentially political poems. And so a lot of people think, oh, the conceptualism it just doesn't have anything to say. And they're really deeply political, whether it's a strategy like N+7 in Rosemary Waldrop's hands, where she rewrites the Declaration of Independence using this kind of constraining but also somewhat arbitrary but also deterministic method. We holler these trysts to be self-exiled, that all manatees are created equidistant, that they are endured by their creditor, not creator, with cervical unanswerable rims, etc. What a way to challenge and disorient us to the Declaration of Independence. Or when Mike McGee comes in as a flarfist and sort of sounds his way through the Pledge of Allegiance to the point where it degrades, I planned a neat myth, today's rags, ugly unified fates never heard of you, and 10 and 3 colonies or 50 nifty states, coronation, underground, into mythical palabricity, and just this for all. Or indeed, it all started when we were brought here as slaves from Africa. Deeply political poem, obviously, but as much as a sound poem. Several of us have been rereading Terence Dupre's book on The Survivor. It's called The Survivor, and one of the points he makes is relevant in this case. It's a little dramatic to think about genocide in relation to impeachment and what a president can say or do, but what the heck. So in this book, Dupre argues something counterintuitive, that silence, which is often a response to life in extremity or trauma, a reasonable response for some people. Silence, you can't find the words at all, so you remain silent. Your voice has been taken away from you. Silence is one response. Of course, silence equals death, so silence is not optimal in any sense, but it can happen. Where to put the scream in relation to silence? The scream is often also a way of expressing that you don't know what to say, that you can't find the words, so you scream. Normally what you do is you put articulate, organized, bearing witness and testimony on the positive constructive side of this ledger, and you put scream and silence over on the wow, there's nothing that can be done and things are bad. What Dupre argues, and I'm persuaded by it, and I'm reminded of some of the work of Jaap Blonk and Tracie Morris and others, is that the scream is actually closer to giving testimony. That the scream is a way of saying, the words are falling apart, but I still have a voice and I'm going to make noise. It's going to be agonized noise. It's going to not make that much sense, but it's going to be a human voice reaching out vocally through the organic mechanisms that we have to make noise, to refuse silence. Scream is closer to testimony than it is to silence. Language has consequences, right? And we have a president who sort of is very blissfully ignorant of the fact that language has that words have consequences.